Growing up, my brother Mason always thought he was the clever one. He was 3 years older, tall, charming, and seemed to have the kind of natural confidence that made everyone believe he could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the quiet sibling, the one who kept her head down, studied hard, and rarely got into trouble. When our father, a retired colonel, encouraged us to consider military careers, Mason jumped at the chance. I wasn't sure at first, but eventually, I enlisted too, not because I wanted to compete with him, but because I genuinely believed in serving. Over the years, while Mason enjoyed flaunting his connections and cracking jokes at every opportunity, I buried myself in the work. I wasn't chasing recognition, I simply wanted to prove to myself that I could make a difference. By the time I was 32, I had worked my way into a position of respect within my unit. It wasn't glamorous, but my commanding officers knew I was dependable, disciplined, and dedicated. Mason, meanwhile, had moved sideways more than up, his charm often saving him from consequences when his mouth got him into trouble. The day everything came to a head was during a joint leadership meeting on base. A high-ranking general was visiting, and everyone knew it was a big deal. Officers and representatives from different divisions were gathered around the long oak table in the conference room. The general himself sat at the head, a man of few words but immense presence. Mason and I rarely crossed paths formally, but on this particular morning, we found ourselves sitting just a few chairs apart. He was smirking from the moment I walked in, as though the idea of me sharing the same table was some kind of joke. When the general asked for updates, I prepared to present my section's report. But before I could speak, Mason leaned over to the officer beside him and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "She probably directs traffic on base." Laughter rippled among a few of the younger officers, but it died quickly when they noticed the general's expression hadn't changed. My face burned hot, and I felt the familiar sting of humiliation. Mason had embarrassed me in front of powerful men before, but never on this scale. For a moment, I considered staying silent, letting it pass. After all, wasn't that what I'd always done? But something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the years of quiet service, maybe it was the knowledge that I had earned my seat at this table, or maybe it was simply the fact that I was tired of my brother's arrogance. I stood up. The room fell quiet. All eyes turned toward me. Mason leaned back in his chair, smirk still plastered across his face, clearly expecting me to stammer or sit back down. Instead, I straightened my uniform, locked eyes with the general, and began to speak. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't direct traffic. I lead the logistics division that ensures every mission within this base has the resources it needs to succeed. My team coordinates supply chains, oversees transport routes, manages risk assessments, and maintains the lifelines that keep operations running smoothly. Without logistics, sir, even the most elite soldiers would be standing still." A hush swept over the room. My voice was steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. I hadn't rehearsed those words, they had come from years of unspoken effort. The general's stern eyes remained fixed on me. For a terrifying moment, I thought I'd overstepped. Then he nodded once, firmly. "Well said," he replied. "Never forget, logistics wins wars. It's not glamorous, but it's essential. And it takes brains and grit to run it well." I could feel Mason shrinking beside me, though he tried to hide it with a forced chuckle. My hands trembled slightly as I sat back down, but I refused to look at him. The rest of the meeting passed with an unusual sense of clarity for me. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just the quiet sister, the afterthought, or the punchline to Mason's jokes. I was an officer in my own right, and I had just proven it in front of one of the most powerful men on base. But little did I know, that moment was only the beginning. Mason wasn't the type to let a bruise to his ego heal quietly. And my decision to finally stand up for myself would trigger a series of events that tested not only my relationship with him but also my future in the military. After that meeting, word spread quickly. On military bases, rumors travel faster than convoys, and it seemed everyone had heard how I had put Mason in his place, without so much as raising my voice. Some congratulated me quietly in the halls, while others simply looked at me with newfound respect. For once, I wasn't Mason's little sister. I was Lieutenant Harper, head of logistics. But Mason? He didn't take it well. That evening, he stormed into my quarters without knocking, his face red with fury. "You humiliated me in front of the general," he barked. I set down the reports I was reviewing and looked him squarely in the eye. "No, Mason. You humiliated yourself. I just told the truth." For a second, I thought he might explode. But instead, he clenched his fists, spun on his heel, and slammed the door on his way out. I should have known then he wouldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, Mason went out of his way to undermine me. He spread whispers that I only got my position because of our father's reputation. He accidentally left my name off important documents. He even tried to reassign some of my team members behind my back. At first, it was frustrating, but then it became dangerous. One night, my unit was preparing to move a shipment of medical supplies. The route was carefully planned, timed to avoid certain risks. When I double-checked the file, I realized the coordinates had been switched. Had we followed them, the convoy would have driven straight into a restricted zone where live-fire training was underway. Someone had tampered with the plan. And I didn't need to guess who. The next morning, I confronted Mason in private. "You could have gotten people killed," I said, my voice low but fierce. He sneered. "Relax. It was just a mix-up. Maybe if you didn't act like you're better than everyone, you'd make fewer mistakes." I wanted to shout, to drag him in front of the general right then and there. But I knew without proof, it would be my word against his. And Mason had always been good at twisting the narrative. So I kept my head down, tightened security around my division, and waited. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A large-scale training exercise was scheduled, involving multiple units. Logistics was at the heart of it: fuel, food, ammo, medical support. Every moving piece had to align perfectly, and I was responsible for making it happen. It was the kind of test that could make or break a career. On the first day, everything ran smoothly, too smoothly. I could sense Mason watching me from across the field, waiting for something to go wrong. And then, on the second day, it did. A supply truck never showed up at its destination. When I traced its orders, I discovered they had been deliberately altered again. Fuel that was meant to reach a remote training squadron had been rerouted, leaving them stranded. This time, I didn't waste a second. I gathered my officers, corrected the route, and sent a backup team with emergency reserves. Then, once the crisis was handled, I went straight to the general with every shred of evidence I had quietly been collecting for weeks: mismatched signatures, false coordinates, and unauthorized access logs. The general listened in silence, his sharp eyes betraying no emotion. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "You've shown restraint," he said at last. "And you've shown foresight. Most would have lashed out. Instead, you kept records. That's discipline." Then he called for Mason. I'll never forget the look on my brother's face when he walked into that office and saw me already there. For once, the smirk was gone. The general wasted no time. He laid out the evidence, point by point, and gave Mason the chance to explain himself. Mason tried. He blamed clerical errors, suggested others had framed him, even implied I was out to ruin his career. But the general wasn't fooled. "You had every opportunity," the general said, his voice like stone. "But instead of proving yourself, you tried to sabotage your own sister. That is not the behavior of an officer. That is the behavior of a coward." The silence that followed was crushing. Mason was stripped of his leadership role and reassigned to menial duties. It wasn't a discharge, but it was a fall from grace so steep it left him reeling. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother not as untouchable, but as human, flawed, bitter, and deeply insecure. Afterward, the general turned to me. "You stood up in that meeting weeks ago," he said. "That took courage. But this? This took more. You protected your team and this base, even when it meant standing against your own family. That's real leadership." His words stayed with me long after I left his office. Mason avoided me after that. The few times we crossed paths, he couldn't meet my eyes. I didn't gloat, though. As satisfying as it was to finally be recognized for my work, part of me mourned the relationship we'd lost. We were siblings once, teammates, in a way. But Mason's pride had driven a wedge so deep I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. Still, I knew one thing for certain: I'd never let myself be silenced again. From that day forward, when I walked into meetings, no one thought of me as the sister who probably directed traffic. They saw me as what I had always been, an officer who had earned her place, through grit, patience, and a refusal to back down when it mattered most. And though my brother's laughter had once echoed in my ears, drowning out my confidence, it no longer held power over me. Because I had found my voice, and when I stood up, the whole room listened.